Proceed with our program and introduce the first speaker. And it is really a pleasure, as you will learn in a minute why, I take great pride in introducing our next speaker, Professor Gregory Ball. Professor Ball is the new incoming dean at the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. And his official work commences on October 1, so not very far away. And it is really a pleasure to have him here because, as you can imagine, he is in a place of transition, and a lot happens during these major transitions. And so we're fortunate that he would take time out of his busy schedule to be with us tonight. I would like to tell you a little bit about his background and then ask him to please come up and address the audience. Professor Gregory F. Ball has been at Johns Hopkins University as Vice Dean for Science and Research Infrastructure, Professor of Psychological and Brain Sciences in the School of Arts and Sciences, and Director of the school's undergraduate neuroscience program. He is, as you can imagine, a highly accomplished scientist, having published works over 200 publications. We are honored that he could be here with us tonight, and please welcome the new incoming Dean of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, Dean Ball.
Thank you, Professor Mahmoudi, for your kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the University of Maryland, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the annual lecture of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace. I am sure that many of you are familiar with the diverse and enriching programming that the chair offers throughout the year and the distinguished speakers the chair frequently brings to campus. Tonight's program and speaker are no exception. I know that we are all looking forward to an illuminating event. I would like to thank Mr. Kenneth Bowers and his colleagues with the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'i of the United States and the Baha'i Chair for World Peace International Advisory Board for joining us this evening and for helping us to make this event possible. The International Advisory Board has gathered here today a remarkable group of Baha'i leaders committed to the mission of the chair, and we are honored and dedicated to continuing the close connection which exists between the University of Maryland and the Baha'i community. As Professor Mahmoudi noted, I have yet to begin my term as Dean. I officially start here at the College of Behavioral and Social Science October 1st. But I'm already aware of the great importance the Baha'i Chair for World Peace plays in the college and the university. So I am really honored to be here today with you. I have learned how the Baha'i Chair holds a special place on our campus because it was the first of the University of Maryland's 3 endowed peace chairs, the 2 other being the George and Lisa Zakhem Khalil Gibran Chair for Values and Peace and the Anwar Sadat Chair for Peace and Development. And it's really one of the many special features of the BSOS College to have chairs in this area. It's quite extraordinary. The incumbents of these chairs, Dr. Suhail Bushrudi and Dr. Shibli Telhami, along with Dr. Mahmoudi, are among our university's most distinguished and celebrated faculty members. And I am proud to note, as I said before, they're all housed in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. They represent a foundational priority for this college and our future. And they will be, I assure you, one of my priorities as the incoming dean to support this area of expertise. The synergies for peace that these 3 chairs can collectively create have been enhanced by the foresight and hard work of Dean Townsend and his staff. So Dean Don Townsend was my predecessor who laid the foundation, and I thank him for his strong commitment to advancing the work of the peace chairs and placing them prominently as centers of excellence for advancing the university's core goals of diversity, internationalization, and cross-disciplinary collaboration. The Baha'i Chair believes that at the heart of global conflicts are outdated patterns of thought and behavior, as well as outdated social structures incapable of addressing the needs of an ever-changing world. Adopting a trifold programmatic objective, the Baha'i Chair for World Peace aims to contribute to the evolution of new patterns we so desperately need by first enhancing the academic life of the University of Maryland community. Second, developing momentum to systematically advance discourse regarding peace studies and policy by generating and disseminating knowledge to stakeholders, and by highlighting features of the panoramic vision of world peace that the Baha'i texts offer, benefiting the intellectual life of the worldwide global community. In the last 2 years, the Baha'i Chair for World Peace has achieved significant growth in its visibility throughout the University of Maryland community and the campus as a whole. It is done so through the proactive collaboration with other academic departments, centers, and colleges through a strong interdisciplinary approach in preparing future generations of students, indeed the leaders of tomorrow, to understand new thinking about social change that is needed to create a better nation and a better world for us to live in. Through events and outreach, the chair is reaching a diverse and global audience by including and inviting other colleges and universities regionally, including prestigious think tanks, NGOs, as well as those at the United Nations in New York. I would like to take this opportunity to assure this distinguished audience that the University of Maryland anticipates with enthusiasm many more years of fruitful collaboration with the Baha'i community, primarily, although not exclusively, through the good offices of this Baha'i Chair for World Peace. My immediate predecessor, Dean John Townsend, our interim Dean, Dr. Wayne McIntosh, and our successive presidents of the University of Maryland, Britt Kerwin, Dan Mote, and our current president, Wallace Lowe, have taken keen personal interest in the establishment, development, and advancement of the Baha'i Chair. And tonight, I pledge that the pattern of support established by my colleagues will continue and will grow. And based on even the short preliminary conversation I've had with this advisory board, I see some very exciting developments in the future. So I thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Dean Ball, for those comments. We welcome you to the University of Maryland and wish you all the best in your new position and your very esteemed position in the college. Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Kenneth E. Bowers. Mr. Bowers has served since 2007 as the Secretary of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States. Since the inception of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace some 20 years ago, the National Spiritual Assembly has been a source of constant support and wise counsel, not only to the holders of the chair, but to the University of Maryland's leadership. In addition to this significant role, the generosity of the National Spiritual Assembly continues to ensure the financial security of the Baha'i Chair. Mr. Kenneth Bowers is the National Spiritual Assembly's liaison to the Advisory Board of the Baha'i Chair, and in this capacity, I cannot thank him enough for his support and time. Mr. Bowers has served and now is serving as the Secretary of the National Spiritual Assembly, and I have to tell you that he has a very busy schedule, and again, to have been able to have him with us today has really been a pleasure, and I'd like to now welcome him and invite him to the podium. Mr. Kenneth Bowers.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests. It's really an honor to be able to speak briefly to you this evening on behalf of the Baha'is of the United States. And as was mentioned, we have an international advisory board that met today. And we also had the privilege today of welcoming to the meeting some of the members of the university administration, some of the staff. And I was deeply struck by a comment that one of the university officials made, that the University of Maryland is searching for ideas that can change the world, and that the Baha'i Chair for World Peace potentially is a very important source of such ideas. But of course, peace itself is not a terribly new idea. In fact, it's a concept, I'm sure we will agree, that goes back to the beginning of history itself. And moreover, it seems to be a universal aspiration of the human race. And in our own time, the concept that all members of the human family are ultimately one, that we are all the stewards of a common home, that the nations share essential interests, and that we are in the midst of a process leading to the creation of a global civilization, finds general currency among leaders of thought. But we can also see that the full implications of such an understanding have yet to be explored and still less fully applied in a world that is increasingly shaken by grave threats to its peace and its prosperity. What I took from the comment then was not so much that peace is the new idea, rather that what there needs to be is a new approach to peace, a process that links vision and values to a knowledge-based process, an approach, in other words, that is as concrete and effective as it is noble and idealistic. The Baha'i chair proposes that such an approach would begin with a conceptual framework wherein the many facets of modern civilization can be seen as organically linked and mutually reinforcing, and where even the very concept of human nature itself is closely examined and better understood. And then coupled with this framework, a rigorous process of generation and application of knowledge that gradually builds our capacity together to address the issue. And while the path to peace, of course, necessarily involves all of the people of the world, there is also every reason to assert that academia must also be a key forum for addressing these complex questions. To me, the comment of that university colleague signified another important idea, and that is to achieve peace involves not only knowledge in a technical sense, it also involves wisdom. That is, it requires advocates who consciously connect policies and programs with higher moral and spiritual values. And for this reason, we are especially pleased and proud of the association of the Baha'i Chair with the University of Maryland. This great institution has become a world-class leader in every branch of learning. It has in innumerable ways demonstrated its profound commitment to the rigorous search for truth. It has consciously adopted the goal of raising up generations of future leaders who will be guided in their life's work by such values as will render them able to make contributions to the betterment of the world. In other words, not only knowledgeable people, but people who have a true moral compass. As Montaigne said, we can know with another man's knowledge, but we cannot be wise with another man's wisdom. The University of Maryland understands this and is dedicated to producing people who are both wise and learned. The Baha'i Chair's wide-ranging programs and activities are a source of pride to the Baha'is the world over, as is our relationship with this justly renowned institution of higher learning that shares the vision of global peace. For more than 2 decades, the Chair has benefited from the support and the encouragement of university faculty and administrators, and we have been deeply impressed throughout the years by their vision, their collegiality, and their generosity of spirit, and are confident that under the leadership of the incoming Dean, Dr. Gregory Ball, that this relationship will continue to grow and to flourish. And of course, we are extremely grateful and proud of the services of the present holder of the chair, Dr. Hoda Mahmoudi. So in this spirit, it is my great privilege to offer a more tangible tribute to that confidence in the university and the chair. The funds, so that those of you who are not members of the Baha'i faith will appreciate this, that we receive in the governing body of the Baha'i faith of the United States are contributed voluntarily by members of the Baha'i faith throughout the country and are held by the National Assembly as a sacred trust. And the understanding of that trust is that they will be expended on activities that are truly worthy of our vision for a peaceful world. So with this in mind, I'm happy now to offer a contribution on behalf of the Baha'is of the United States for the Baha'i Chair of World Peace in the amount of $100,000. And best wishes to you in your new post of service. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your generosity.
I would now like to invite another distinguished speaker to the podium, Dr. Kumeya Shorter Gooden. She is the University of Maryland's inaugural Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer, and she, in this capacity, she heads the university's diversity office, working with the academic population as well as the administration, including, of course, President Lowe, the president of the university, on a number of issues related to diversity, collaboration, and community building. She received a bachelor's degree, magna cum laude, from Princeton University with its first class of women. She earned, yes. She earned a PhD in clinical community psychology from the University of Maryland, College Park. So she's one of ours. And she is co-author of Shifting: The Double Lives of Black Women in America, which is a winner of the 2004 American Book Awards. Please welcome Dr. Kumeya Shorter-Gooden.
Thank you so much, Professor Mahmoudi. Good evening. I am delighted to be here with you at Maryland's 2014 Baha'i Chair for World Peace Annual Lecture. What a time this is. Gaza, Iraq, Syria, Ferguson. Unfortunately, we live in a time of great violence where peace far too often eludes us. These big newsworthy events grab our attention, but the violence is often on a smaller scale, perhaps invisible but for a security camera or a 911 tape. It's in an elevator in a casino in Atlantic City, or in a hotel room in Atlanta. Did you all hear about that one? U.S. District Judge Mark Fuller was arrested for beating his wife just under 6 weeks ago. And the violence is often subtle. It's the offhand remarks of a Donald Sterling. It's the very name of a professional football team not too far from here. It's the verbal sexual harassment that far too many women contend with. It's the microaggressions that students of color experience on campus. The homophobic comments or the homophobic slur written on a whiteboard in the dorm. Here at Maryland, we're committed to building an equitable, diverse, and inclusive community, one that educates all students, whether they're studying English or engineering or education, to engage respectfully, effectively, and justly with those who are different, those from different cultural or identity groups. We're committed to building a community that conducts scholarship and research that has real-world impact, that can help us to better understand, for example, the dynamics of violence and its antecedents, and the relationship between food insecurity and violence, between fear and violence, between hopelessness and violence. Scholarship and research that teaches us that peace is not simply the absence of violence, and that it gauges us in how to develop, create, and sustain neighborhoods, campuses, cities, nations, and a world where there's a sense of community, where there's justice, prosperity, and peace. Here at Maryland, we have the capacity to help transform the world. But we first need to look at ourselves a bit more closely, at how we may collude in ways big and small with a culture of violence and with a climate that compromises peace. We need to check ourselves and commit to growing together. Given the urgency of what's happening in the world today, and given our potential here at Maryland to upend it and to be part of creating something new, it is wonderful to be with you all this evening at this 2014 Baha'i Chair for World Peace Annual Lecture, and to hear from the distinguished Eduardo Bonilla-Silva about the problem of racism in post-racial America. Thank you.
Every year, and usually during the fall semester, the Baha'i Chair for World Peace holds its annual lecture. The purpose of the annual lecture is to invite a distinguished scholar whose outstanding scholarship addresses issues about which the Baha'i Chair is keenly interested in the search for solutions in removing obstacles to peace. Tonight's lecture on the topic of racism in America addresses one of the major impediments to creation of a just society. Many questions about racism occupy the work of the Baha'i Chair. For example, how can education and knowledge, especially at an institution of higher learning, contribute to the profound change in the structure of society such that all of its members are safeguarded and treated as equal? Likewise, how can institutions alter practices and patterns that promote racism? What can we learn from sound research about identity and the dangerous trend both in the US and throughout the world where our common human identity is giving way to fragmentation and social breakdown? The appalling and tragic death of Michael Brown is yet another painful reminder of the long history and deep-rooted evil of structural racism in America. As a society, we cannot find peace or harmony as long as a segment of our population is humiliated and denied equal rights and opportunity. Nor can a society achieve justice and well-being as long as its social institutions discriminate and harm a segment of its population. In his book, The Decent Society, Professor of Philosophy Avishai Margalit points out that the elements of threat to the victim of institutional humiliation is generally greater than is humiliation by private individuals, since institutions are generally more powerful than individuals and so can be more damaging. He explains that a society is decent if its institutions do not act in ways that give the people under their authority sound reason to consider themselves humiliated. To address the complexity and challenge that surrounds the problem of racism in America, to expand our knowledge about this very important subject, we are most fortunate this evening to have with us our outstanding scholar, our esteemed speaker, Dr. Eduardo Bonilla-Silva. Professor Silva is professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at Duke University with affiliations in the following units: African American Studies, Latin American Studies, Latino Studies, and Institute for Critical U.S. Studies. After completing his graduate studies at the University of Wisconsin, he had academic appointments at the University of Michigan and Texas A&M, and now, of course, at Duke. Professor Bonilla has gained visibility in the social sciences with his 1997 American Sociological Review article entitled "Rethinking Racism Toward a Structural Interpretation," where he challenged social analysts to analyze racial matters from a structural perspective rather than from a sterile prejudice perspective. He has written numerous books. I'll just name a few of them: White Supremacy and Racism in Post-Civil War Era. It was the co-winner of the 2002 Oliver Cox Award given by the American Sociological Association. And Racism Without Racist: Colorblind Racism and the Persistence of Racial Inequality in the United States, which won the 2004 Choice Award. Dr. Bonilla-Silva received the prestigious 2004 Louis Koser Award for Theoretical Agenda Setting, and in 2011, the Cox-Johnson-Fraser Award given by the American Sociological Association. Currently, he's working on 2 books with co-authors, Anything But Racism, How Social Analysts Limit the Significance of Race, and White Logic, White Methods, Racism and Methodology. He is also working on a project entitled We Are All Americans, the Latin Americanization of Race Relations in the USA, where he explores the changing dynamics of racial stratification in the United States. Dr. Bonilla-Silva lectures on racial and ethnic matters all over the United States and more recently internationally. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming this year's annual lecturer, Dr. Bonilla-Silva, on the topic of the problem of racism in post-racial America. Dr. Eduardo Bonilla-Silva.
Good evening. I'm happy you clap for me, but maybe at the end you may want to take it back. So today I will tackle huge questions such as, why is it so hard to talk about race in contemporary America? Why do we have racial problems almost 50 years after the Civil Rights Revolution? And why are these things happening in a country that elected a black man as president 6 years ago? To address these questions, I will challenge whites' contemporary racial common sense, which include the idea that racism has declined in significance, the notion that racial minorities are the ones racializing issues because we play the infamous race card, and the mythology that the election of a black man as president is clear and convincing evidence that we have become a post-racial nation. I will argue that although racism and discrimination have changed in form, they are still very real and affect the life chances of all Americans. To make my case, I will do 3 things. First, explain what racism is all about. Second, I will describe the nature of the dominant form of discrimination in America. And third, I will illustrate the nature of the form of racial discourse that we have in the US and has been with us since the late 1970s, something that I call colorblind racism. I will then conclude by outlining some things we might consider doing to move forward in our quest to attain racial justice in our country. This is a lot to do, so please, passengers, fasten your intellectual seatbelts, as I will go like in the movie, fast and furious. So the first thing I want to do is conceptual, because I believe it has monumental implications. And talking about theory is like taking medicine. It tastes bad, but it's good for you. So please bear with me. For most whites, racism is the KKK, neo-Nazis, or more recently, Cliven Bundy, the Nevada rancher who believes blacks were better off during slavery picking cotton, and Donald Sterling, owner of the Clippers, who told his girlfriend not to pose in pictures with blacks or bring them to the games of his team. Hence, the folk or common sense definition of racism is the irrational belief some people have about the presumed inferiority of others. So what is wrong with interpreting these events or people as racist? The problem, as I see it, is twofold. First, by classifying overt and crass racial events as what racism is all about, so I'm not saying that this is not racism, I'm saying that It's that and more, yeah? We fail to understand that racism forms a social system. That is, that we all participate in racism as a system, some as beneficiaries and some as the victims of the system. And we all participate whether we like it or not, and whether we're conscious of it or not. It's not enough for you to say, I'm beyond race. That is impossible, yeah? We're in a racialized community, we all participate of race stratification. If racism were limited to the actions, beliefs, or comments of a few obnoxious folks, racism would have been eliminated from the face of the earth a long time ago. And I know this is heavy, the idea that it benefits whites, and that whites form a social group, and that we all participate actively or passively, consciously or unconsciously. In the discussion, we can go deeper into this discussion, okay? The second problem with conceiving racism as a psychological quirk or as the overt behavior of some individuals is that we miss most of the racial affairs happening before our own eyes. As I will argue soon, the bulk of racial events and behaviors nowadays are subtle, institutionalized, and seemingly non-racial. Therefore, by focusing our attention on overt racial events for moral judgment and political action, we first legitimate an erratic conceptualization of racism. Yeah? Second, we cloud efforts to bring to the fore discussions about how race matters in the everyday life. Race is not just something that happens every year, this big event. It happens every day. And lastly, we help sustain the notion of America the Beautiful, yeah? America is a country that is no longer racist, and that presumably, as we love to say in universities, racially motivated incidents are isolated incidents, yeah? Of course, they keep happening again and again and again and again. So as social analysts, we need to always connect the dots, yeah? If they keep happening again and again and again, in a country that claims to be post-racial, we have to explain why that is the case. So then, what is racism? So racism is then anchored around real practices and behaviors that produce positions of relative privilege for some and of subordination for others. Therefore, the crux of racism as a system is material and rational rather than psychological and irrational. Systemic racism remains in place because it benefits whites as a social group. Let me now talk briefly about the second matter in my talk, the state of contemporary discrimination in the nation. I have labeled the dominant practices responsible for contemporary racial inequality as the new racism. When Jim Crow died, I'm going to contend, a new systemic racism took its place, yeah? We didn't kill Freddy Krueger. Freddy Krueger keeps coming back, yeah? Racism is like Freddy Krueger, you know, you think he's dead, and the monster comes back, yeah? So by this new racism, I mean the subtle and apparently beyond race character of most public racial practices. This system of racial practices, which has all but replaced the Jim Crow racial order of the past, emerged in the late 1960s as an outcome of the civil rights and uncivil rights movement. So alongside the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King, well, let's always remember, between 1960 and 1970, 250 so-called race riots, yeah? So people in the streets demanding justice. Second, as an accommodation to the black migration from the South, yeah? As blacks moved from the South, North, East, West, anywhere but the Deep South, yeah? The system, which was predicated on keeping blacks in the South, had to be restructured, yeah? Third, as a response to the state to criticisms from socialist and third world countries that kept telling the US, you guys criticize us for not being democratic, for being this and that, but look at the way you treat blacks, Chicanos, Puerto Ricans, yeah? And lastly, as a business necessity, much like in South Africa some years ago, in the 60s and 70s, the business community decided we need to retool race stratification because it's affecting business. So long as you have 250 riots, remember I told you, 250 race rebellions across the nation, Chicago, St. Louis, et cetera, that affects the business climate, yeah? Hard for you to sell commodities when people are burning the street, yeah? So all that then produce a change in the social order. And for details on that, you can read my book. First commercial, yeah? Let me give you a few specific examples of new racism practices. We all know that residential segregation was maintained in the Jim Crow era through the racial terrorism of some whites, which unfortunately still happens from time to time. Housing covenants, agreements between property owners not to sell or rent to minority people, etc. And lastly, by the active participation of the federal government, which, among other things, certified racist lending practices such as redlining. These are maps where a bank say, if you live here, I'm going to charge you a higher premium, yeah? Which we still do, by the way. It's illegal, but we still do it, yeah? And the federal government also transferred billions of dollars to whites for the construction of roads to access white suburbia. But these practices became illegal, and the normative climate of the post-civil rights era disallows the open exercise of racist behavior. Therefore, one would expect then residential segregation to have declined. It has barely declined. So why? Residential segregation remains a big problem in our country because discrimination in the housing and lending markets are still in place. Report after report document how little we have improved in this area and how new racism practices are behind our current levels of residential apartheid, to borrow the term of Professor Doug Massey and his collaborator Nancy Denton. For example, the authors of a recent report issued by the Civil Rights Project at Harvard titled More Than Money noted that, and I quote, affordability alone cannot explain the existing pattern of segregation in Massachusetts, and added, the main reasons for continuing segregation include steering by realtors, yeah? So realtors basically tell folks of color, this is a good place for you, yeah? And this is for you, white folks, yeah? So the realtors are central in the contemporary landscape of segregation. Subprime loans given disproportionately to people of color, and we have learned a lot about that in the last few years, yeah? And lastly, by a lack of action by the area cities and towns. Another report in 2006 by the Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston indicated that their testers, so how do we demonstrate discrimination nowadays? We have testers, yeah? And we match people. We send blacks, whites, Latinos with similar characteristics except for phenotype or accents, yeah? Like I have an accent from Western Pennsylvania because I was born 52 years ago in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. Can you all detect my Western Pennsylvania? I'm not kidding, I was born here. Yep, okay. Anyway, so they send these testers and they experience discrimination 45% of the cases, and their black testers, 50%. The report also indicated that besides steering by realtors, the exclusionary tactic most often used was providing differential information to minority applicants about the availability of housing units. All in all, whites were 5 to 6 times more likely to be told about available units than minority applicants. And I keep throwing 5 to 6 times. Think about that. The report told of one black tester who was advised that the apartments she had seen were not available until January 1st, whereas the white tester, December 1st. Yeah? So now we have the empirical data because they talked to the same person and the person gave differential information. In another case, a Latino tester and a white tester emailed an agent and left voice messages. The white tester received a return email with pictures of available units. The Latino tester is still waiting for a response. Regarding the banking industry, the Center for Responsible Lending released a study in 2006 based on about 180,000 loans processed in the state of North Carolina in 2004, the year I moved to North Carolina, so I feel very uncomfortable with this data. And they found that after controlling for all sorts of characteristics, blacks were still like 30% more likely to pay a higher interest rate on fixed rate home loans. And for young people who don't know about this, a point difference amounts to a heck of a lot of money in a 30-year time. In another study by the Woodstock Institute, they found that blacks were 6 times more likely to get a subprime loan than whites, and Latinos were 5 times more likely. In 2006, African Americans were 2.38 times more likely to be denied a conventional mortgage to purchase a home than whites. All these housing and banking practices exemplify what I call new racism or new style discrimination because they are very hard to detect and even harder to label racial. How can one prove discrimination by banks or realtors or renters? If you're on your own, very hard, yeah? Think about the example I gave you of you did not get a return email. Is that discrimination? Can you go to a court of law and get some reparation based on that? Prima facie? No, the person forgot, deleted the email accidentally, etc. So in the case of banks, we need access to all the loans approved to demonstrate that race matters or have a whistleblower telling us how banks fake the racial funk. Time does not allow me to go further, but similar practices have been documented in other venues and areas of life. Accordingly, given the character of contemporary discrimination, we people of color must bring along a white friend to go shopping, buy a car, get a loan, rent an apartment, buy a house, drive a car, walk in the streets, or to do almost anything in America to prove discrimination. Now let me get off the text. So I'm a black Puerto Rican, yeah? And I am a professor of sociology at Duke. I'm the chair of my department, but I navigate life as a black-looking person with a beautiful accent from Western Pennsylvania, yeah? So when I go to, what you want to put it? Okay. So when I go shopping, I experience, oh, you were not hearing anything? Should I begin again? Okay. So when I go shopping, I experience life as a dark person experiences life in America. So now that I have finally some money, I occasionally go and, want to buy me a nice dress, a nice suit, and often I get and I'm sure that African Americans particularly will relate to this, I get either I'm ignored, and I literally have to, hey, can you help me? Really? You really think you can afford that? Or I get, may I help you? A minute later, may I help you? And sometimes 3 times, may I help you? So now I go by the rule of 2. The first time, very politely, world peace. May I help you? No, I'm just looking. Second time, may I help you? I'm like, yes. I'm trying to steal this fancy code. And I was wondering if you could give me some pointers. Oh, I didn't mean it like that. Yes, you did. Because if you didn't mean it like that, your reaction should have been, what are you talking about? I'm trying to be helpful here, yeah? So I travel across the nation, and folks in the audience come and tell me, in my store, we don't do that, but we do this. So all kinds of creative ways. And what all these things have in common is that if someone were to go to a court of law, think about it. What would be the accusation? Extreme politeness. This person asking 3 times, may I help you? Case dismissed. So let me now move on and address the third leg of my talk, the characteristics of the dominant racial discourse in the USA. I will delve a bit more on this matter because I believe it is fundamental for understanding the difficulty we're having in talking about race in straight fashion and understanding race matters nowadays. I have addressed this subject in my book, Racism Without Racists, where I argue that the nasty racial discourse of the past has been, for the most part, replaced by a more civilized racism that I label colorblind racism. By this I mean the new dominant racial ideology anchored on the abstract extension of the principles of liberalism to racial matters that provides apparently non-racial explanations to account for all kinds of racial outcomes. And this ideology is comprised of frames, style, and racial stories. Okay, that wasn't too subliminal, but I told you I am black and Puerto Rican. I have a kid, my son, Papi, like, can you float me $1,000? I'm like, you mind? $1,000, man, that's a lot of money. The central frames of this ideology are minimization of racism, cultural racism, naturalization, and abstract liberalism. For time's sake, I will illustrate only two of these frames. And the first one is abstract liberalism, which I think is the core of this ideology. So this frame explains race-related matters in the language of liberalism, but in an abstract and decontextualized manner. So when I give you an illustration, you'll be like, oh, I have heard things like that in my classes, and many of my friends say things like that, yeah? So the example I have is Jim, who is a 30-year-old computer salesperson from a privileged background who explained his opposition to affirmative action in the following way. I think it's unfair top to bottom on everybody. And the whole process, it often, discrimination itself is a bad word, right? But you discriminate every day. You want to buy a beer at the store, and there are 6 kinds of beers. You can get from Natural Light to Sam Adams, right? And you look at the price, and you look at the kind of beer, and it's a choice. And a lot of that you have laid out in front of you. Which one you get? Now, should the government sponsor Sam Adams and make it cheaper than Natural Light because it's brewed by someone in Boston? That doesn't make much sense, right? Why would we want that or make Sam Adams 8 times as expensive because we want people to buy Natural Light? Okay, so I use this quote precisely because it's the kind of quote that some of you will be like, so? I'm like, well, that's what I'm here, to tell you what is problematic with this explanation or justification for not supporting affirmative action. So Jim assumes that hiring decisions are like market choices, choosing between competing brands of beer. So therefore, he takes a totally laissez-faire approach, yeah? Hire the best qualified. The problem with Jim's view, a view shared by most whites, is that labor market discrimination is alive and well and affects Black and Latino job applicants anywhere between 30 to 50% of the time. So depending on the study that you check, 30 to 50% of the time. Now we have research that you don't even need to show up to an interview to experience discrimination. So experimental work by Diva Pager, where she submits fake resumes. It's the same resume, and she just has white-sounding names, Johnny, whatever, and then Tyrone, yeah? And it's the same resume, advantage white by a mile. And in a second project, she said, let me up the ante and say that the white applicant has a criminal background. Mind you, I happen to believe that we need to have second, third chances in life, and actually, I have a very radical view of what we should do with the prison system. Yeah? I'm for abolition of the system. Yep, I said it. But that said, let's understand that in the market out there, that we're not there yet. And most employers do not want to hire people with criminal records. So guess what happens in this experimental work? Who should get the job offer? The black applicant without a criminal record or the white applicant with a criminal record? Advantage white, still. Okay. Furthermore, although Jim believes, as do most whites, that jobs in America are awarded in meritocratic fashion, that is, we hire the best, research have documented that anywhere between 80-85% of jobs are obtained through networks, through connections, yeah? Young folks, get your degree, that degree matters. But while you're here, make sure you connect with, what is your last name? Oh, Rockefeller, can we talk? So therefore, by upholding a strict laissez-faire view on hiring while ignoring the significant impact of discrimination in the labor market, Jim can safely voice his opposition to affirmative action in an apparently race-neutral way. So that is the trick of colorblindness. You talk about race, but in a seemingly beyond race way. The other framework that I want to illustrate is one that we should be all familiar with, and is cultural racism. And it's a frame that actually has been in the US for a long time. And William Ryan pointed out a long time ago that this frame was, you can capture it with the phrase, blaming the victim, yeah? Arguing that minorities' status is the product of their lack of effort, loose family organization, and or inappropriate values. An example of how whites use this frame is Kim, a student at Midwestern University. When asked, many whites explain the status of blacks in this country as a result of blacks lacking motivation, not having the proper work ethic, or being lazy. What do you think? And Kim said, yeah, I totally agree with that. I don't think, they're all like that because we have President Obama, he's different. Anyway, oh, that's not there. I don't think that, they're all like that, but I mean, it's just that if it wasn't that way, why would there be so many blacks living in the projects? Why would there be so many poor blacks? If they work hard, they could make it just as high as anyone else could. I just think that they are raised that way and they see their parents, and so they assume that's the way it should be, and they just follow the roles their parents had for them and don't go anywhere. Although not all whites in my samples were as explicit as this student, most subscribe to this belief, whether in its nastiest, most direct version, or in a compassionate, conservative way. Poor blacks, poor Latinos, that they don't have the culture, the values, they don't know how to raise their kids. Now, ideologies are not just about ideas, opinions, and views. They're also about style, about the verbal strategies we use to manufacture racial statements in public in a period where the norms of what can be said about race in company have changed. Yeah? In the book, I uncover 5 major stylistic components of colorblindness, namely semantic moves, projection, diminutives, avoidance of racist talk, and rhetorical incoherence. And I'll give you examples of semantic moves and of rhetorical incoherence. So semantic moves are phrases such as, I'm not a racist, but, or some of my best friends are black. I don't know their name, but I know they are some of my best friends. And these phrases allow whites to express their racial views in a coded, somewhat safe way, because they can always go back to the safety of the disclaimer. Didn't I tell you that some of my best friends are black? So don't call me names. However, these phrases that I just mentioned have become sort of passé, and ideology is always evolving. It's a never finished product. Therefore, new moves have emerged, and one of them is the move that I label yes and no. And this move, the example I'm going to give you is Sandra, a retail salesperson in her 40s, who answered the question, are you for or against affirmative action? And she answered in the following apparently cryptic way. Yes and no. I feel someone should be able to have something, education, job, whatever, because they have earned it, they deserve it, they have the ability to do it. You don't want to put a 6-year-old as a rocket scientist. They don't have the ability. It doesn't matter if the kid's black or white, as far as letting one have the job over another one just because of the race or the gender. I don't believe in that. So remember, yes and no. But if you really pay attention, her stand on affirmative action is a strong no, since she does not find any reason whatsoever for affirmative action programs to exist. Okay, an example of rhetorical incoherence. And it refers to people becoming incomprehensible when addressing racially sensitive subjects. A good example of how this works is Ray, a student at Midwestern University, who was extremely articulate throughout the interview, but became almost incomprehensible when discussing whether he had ever been attracted to people of color. So we designed these projects assuming that we know how questions are going to be interpreted. We put people of color. Some of the respondents said things like, do Italians count? People of color, so I'm assuming that some of them will say, yeah, I have my Asian girlfriend, yeah, so I'm beyond race, I have that, you know. This particular respondent heard people of color and translated that in his mind to black women. So this was his answer. So to answer that question, no. But I would not ever preclude a black woman from being my girlfriend on the basis that she was black. You know what I mean. If you're looking about it from, the standpoint of just attraction, I think all women have a sort of different type of beauty, if you will. And I think that, for black women, it's somewhat different than white women. But I don't think it's, it's nothing that would ever stop me from I don't know. I don't know if that's just sort of been my impression. It's not like I would ever say, no, I'll never have a black girlfriend. But it just seems to me like I'm not as attracted to black women as I am to white women for whatever reason. It's not about prejudice. It's sort of whatever. Just sort of the way, I see white women as compared to black women, By the way, the person, so I didn't do the interviews. I did what is called race matching. So I have whites interviewing whites and blacks. So this person, and I taught them about interviewing techniques, and I told them that you have to be responsible to your respondents, and that you have to listen, and you have to follow up if needed. So she followed up, and she was like, so he said, so do you know what I mean? I said, no, I don't know. Can you elaborate? And he went another 5 minutes. Well, that I don't know. It's sort of you know what I mean. Okay, the last component of colorblind racism is racial stories. Again, for time's sake, I will only provide one example of what I call storylines and one of what I call testimonies. For more, get the book. So storylines are socially shared tales that are fable-like and incorporate a common scheme or wording, yeah? And they are impersonal, generic, with little narrative content. When I mention them, you'll be like, oh, I heard that, yes? So let me give you the four major storylines of the contemporary period. The past is the past. Second one, I didn't own any slaves. Jews, Italians, and Irish have made it. How come blacks, and particularly black Puerto Ricans, have not? Yeah? And lastly, I did not get a job or was admitted to Maryland because of a minority. Yeah? An example of how whites use these storylines is Roland, an electrical engineer in his 40s, who combined the storylines "the past is the past" and the one "I didn't own any slaves" to oppose the idea of reparations. By the way, we can have another debate about whether or not we should support affirmative action. I do believe that we have to support affirmative action. And reparations, I do believe that we have to consider that. But that's not my point now. I'm just analyzing the justifications for their positions, yeah? I think they have gotten enough. I don't think we need to pay them anything. Or I think as long as they are afforded opportunities and avail themselves to the opportunities like everybody else, I don't know why we should give them any reparation for something that happened. I can't help what happened in the 1400s, the 1500s, or the 1600s, when the blacks were brought over here and put into slavery. I had no control over that. Neither did you. So I don't think we should do anything as far as reparations are concerned. Of interest here, in case you missed it, is that although the question dealt with the effects of past and contemporary discrimination, Roland, like most whites, translated the issue to the slavery era. So let's say that you disagree completely with my argument about race matters in the last 50 years. At least let's educate our white brothers and sisters about after slavery was abolished. We have 100 years more of this thing called Jim Crow, yeah? Which is not in the radar when we have a lot of the discussion about race inequality in America. Yeah, they assume slavery ended, that's it. I'm like, yeah, but after slavery, we had Jim Crow, which was another form of slavery, yeah? Okay, so let me give you an example of a testimony, which are accounts where the narrator is a central participant in the story or is close to the character in the story. And these testimonies are very important because I allow people to vent animosity because they are claiming I'm very close. Now, when you read the examples, they're not necessarily sort of accurate, but you then can vent animosity. The following is an example of what I call a negative testimony of interaction. And it Bill, a retired school teacher, who narrated this testimony to explain why he thinks that blacks and whites are different. After pointing out that blacks seem to, and I quote, to be very religious people, and that they bought a church in his neighborhood, he claimed they forced a restaurant out of business and explained the situation as follows. They like to eat. They piled their dishes just loaded with that stuff, and I actually didn't see it, but I saw one lady come in with a full plate of chicken. I didn't pay much attention, but the next thing I know, they are leaving. Now, I know she didn't eat all that chicken. She probably put it in her purse and walked out with it. A lot of them are doing that. How can they make any money? Meaning the restaurant. And seeing that they are all heavy people, it seems like they do a lot of eating. So I don't know what to say about something like that. Although this story is based on Bill's old-fashioned, so this is an older respondent, actually in his 70s, but he's trying to play the new drama, yeah? He probably grew up under the Jim Crow period, and now it's a new ideology in play, and he's not using the new techniques in a very effective way, but he's trying, yeah? But the bottom line is that he used his testimony to validate his belief that blacks like to eat, are cheap, and steal. Since I want to make sure that we have some time for discussion, let me conclude by bringing my story together. Hence, let me give you some take-home points and address specifically how they all relate to our inability to talk about race matters and to appreciate the significance of race nowadays. First, racism is alive and well, and we ought to work hard at explaining to our audiences that racism is not just prejudice. Prejudice is part of racism, but it's not the foundation, yeah? But that it forms a structure. It is, you don't want to use the term structure? Forget about it. Call it institutional. Call it systemic racism, if you will. And that we all participate in this system. Second, discrimination remains in place, but that's changing character and form from in your face to now you see it, now you don't. Third, colorblind racism, the new racial ideology at play, defends the racial order in a covert, seemingly non-racial, yet tremendously effective manner. It is easier for me to fight someone who calls me the N-word or any other things than someone who sort of hints at that in a creative way without using the language and tropes of the past. Therefore, the reason we cannot talk about race openly and clearly is because whites and non-whites conceive the problem of racism in ways that reflect their different positions in the racial order. For whites, as a dominant racial group, racism is prejudice, which in their view is all but a relic of the past. In contrast, for non-whites, particularly for blacks, as the subordinated racial group in America, racism is systemic. Whites think discrimination is waning, while minority folks know and experience old as well as new style discrimination. Whites believe that prejudice is all but gone. Oh, we have a black president, so that's it. We are now post-racial, yeah? While minority folks know whites have developed a new, more slippery way of defending their privilege. College students can attest to that because you are here where a lot of the transactions you have are for this new character, yeah? Accordingly, we cannot talk about race because this would require us to be talking about the same thing and agreeing on basic racial facts about America. More controversially, I believe we are not likely to talk about race in a straight way because, as I argued today, the problem of racism is not due to ignorance, craziness, or based on misunderstanding one another. The root of the problem is inequality and power. And problems of inequality and power are addressed by social movements and protests by the affected parties and their allies against the powers that be. And now listen to me, no more PowerPoint. I believe that people of good faith, people who are against inequalities of all kinds, have a moral obligation to work towards social and racial justice, here and everywhere in the world. Christians, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, non-religious people, and members of the Baha'i faith should be absolutely and resolutely committed to the struggle for social and racial justice. We must change our commitment from claiming that we are non-racist to becoming anti-racist. And there is a big difference. The so-called non-racist person claims to be beyond race and professes to be a good person who treats everybody the same. But since racism is structural, systemic, being good is not good enough. And even treating people the same is not enough, because treating everybody the same in a world riddled with inequality maintains inequality. What we need is to become anti-racist folks, people who work towards the elimination of all the practices, behaviors, institutions, and cultural elements that reproduce racial inequality. People who understand that to realize Martin Luther King's dream of equality, we must be affirmative in action and seriously ponder the need for reparations. Becoming anti-racist activists also entails working very hard to change our own personal practices and life, to examine and re-examine ourselves with the help of people of color, to remove from our mind and soul racialized understandings of things and of people. We all must do the very best to live an integrated life, which does not guarantee we will be beyond race, but will give us a better shot at it than just proclaiming to the world that we are good people. Since I emphasize the need for social movement politics and believe collective action is central to get to the promised land, I conclude with a quote from Black abolitionist Frederick Douglass. The quote encapsulates the spirit of how I think we should deal with our historical racial problem, and the spirit I hope all of you embrace as fundamental to end once and for all the problem of the color line in America. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are people who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. The struggle might be a moral one, it might be a physical one, it might be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Thank you.